Hi, everyone. Welcome to our seminar today, organized by the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. We are very excited to have Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett here today. But before starting, please let me share with you some information about the seminars. So our institute hosts seminars every week under two different series of seminars. So in our expedition seminars, we host speakers from our affiliate members, including faculty at Northeastern University, while in our Distinguished Lecturers series, we host researchers from different universities and from industry. And in both cases, these are 1-hour seminars, and they include the presentation and the question answering session. Please remember that when you're attending the seminar online, you can submit your questions virtually on the chat anytime. And then let me give you some information about the Institute, about EAI. So at EAI, we do research and development of human-centric AI to create machine learning technology to extend human intelligence. We are a pretty large team, including faculty members from Northeastern University and also research scientists and postdocs. So please, can we go to next slide? Yes. So if you want to know more about us, please scan the QR code and check our website. Next slide, please. You can also, next slide, actually. You can also follow us on social media. So you have here all the necessary information. And finally, if you are starting an AI project and you want our expertise, please contact us. Okay, so now let's start with our seminar today. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University. She also holds appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, where she is Chief Science Officer for the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett is a researcher on psychology and neuroscience. She has published hundreds of papers and also 2 books, and she writes regularly about science in press. She has many accomplishments and distinctions, including the National Institutes of Health Director Pioneer Award, and also a very popular TED Talk that has been viewed over 6.5 million times. Thank you, Lisa, for being here. We are really looking forward to your talk on emotion AI, separating facts from fiction.
Thank you so much, Agatha. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me to speak in the Expeditions seminar today. So a while back, I saw these faces on Twitter. Someone fed them to an emotion AI program, which determined with a high degree of confidence that they were expressions of anger, disgust, and surprise. Here is actually what they took the clips from. And in my view, this is a beautiful illustration of what's wrong with emotion AI as it is currently practiced today. There's a growing economy of emotion reading gadgets, apps, and algorithms. And, if AI can accurately detect emotion in human faces and bodies and brains, then the value, in many sectors of industry and government is obvious and in the law. You could simply just point a camera at a person at an airport or train station or in a courtroom and identify them as angry or disgusted or as potentially a threat. And emotion AI could help with negotiations and communications across culture, particularly like when someone is surprised or confused. But my message here today is that really at this point, machines cannot, in principle, perceive emotion. And that what's currently going on is, I think research is really headed in the wrong direction, because fundamentally, I think people misunderstand the nature of emotion, and as a consequence, they're missing a game-changing opportunity. So my message isn't that machines can't perceive emotion. It's that currently they can't, and that research is, as far as I can see, at least what I'm familiar with, is not really approaching the problem in an optimal way, given what the science of emotion has to tell us. Here's the first misunderstanding. That emotions are universally displayed on the face with expressions that we recognize. People are supposed to smile when they're happy and frown when they're sad and scowl when they're angry and so on. And everyone around the world is supposed to be able to recognize smiles and frowns and scowls as expressions of emotion. And this is the assumption that leads companies to claim that when an algorithm detects a smile, it's detecting happiness or joy. But this is a conflation of an observation and an inference. Measuring facial movements is an observation. Understanding what they mean in emotional terms is an inference. And the two, observation and inference, should never be confused. So consider this evidence. What I'm going to be showing you now is mostly evidence from meta-analyses of hundreds of studies. These are just summaries. So along the x-axis here, I've arrayed the facial movements that have been assumed to be universal expressions of anger, disgust, happiness, anger, disgust, fear, happiness, surprise, and sadness and surprise. So how frequently do people actually make these faces when they express emotion? And the answer is not very much. So on the y-axis, it represents the average proportion of times that people actually make these facial movements during emotional events. So take scowling and anger. When people are angry, they scowl about 35% of the time, which is greater than chance. So that gets you a really good paper in a really good journal. But this means that people move their faces in a variety of other meaningful ways to express anger about 65% of the time. Think about how you yourself express anger. You might widen your eyes and gasp. You might frown. You might cry. You might even smile or laugh. Conversely, people scowl when they're not angry. So scowling in concentration, scowling when somebody tells you a bad joke, scowling in discomfort, 50% of the time. So these are the false positive rates in red. The proportion of times that an expression like a scowl means something other than the stipulated universal meaning. And so what you can see is that if you assumed that if you conflated a scowl with an expression of anger, you'd be wrong 50% of the time. Now, hundreds of studies exist that have been published, which show posed photographs, like the ones that you see on the x-axis here, to test subjects and ask them to select the emotion being portrayed for each of us, and what subjects have to do is they have to choose which emotion is being portrayed, being expressed using a small set of emotion words that derive usually from English or translations from English. And here are the results. So look at these discrepancies between what people believe, what they believe these facial movements mean, and what their actual meaning is. Right? The white bars are how frequently people actually make these faces during episodes of the specified universal emotion. And the blue bars are people's beliefs when in experiments about how frequently these expressions are made. And what do companies use? They use these, which is why they're conflating a movement with its emotional meaning. For almost 40 years, claims of universal emotions were based only on 2 peer-reviewed papers. So basically 4 studies from 2 peer-reviewed papers discussing 3 samples from one part of the world, which was Papua New Guinea. Since 2008, there's been a renewed interest in testing this question, and the majority of studies have found substantial evidence across cultures, particularly these small-scale cultures that have limited access to Western cultural practices and norms. Our lab actually has been to Tanzania to test the Hadza hunter-gatherers, as well as to Namibia to test the Himba. So as reviewed in this paper, if you're interested, detecting a scowl is not the same as detecting anger. It's confusing a measurement with its interpretation. And really, when it comes to expressing emotion, as this paper shows, this is a big summary across basically all of the published research for a handful of emotion categories. Variation, contextualized variation is the norm. If you actually go looking for variation, that is, you design your experiment in such a way to look for variation, structured variation in how people express emotion, you find it. And I'm putting up one paper here in case you're interested. This is a very fun paper that we did. I unfortunately don't have time to talk about it in depth today, but it makes that point really well. So what's the deal here? Like, why are companies spending millions of dollars developing emotion AI using these particular facial movements and assuming that they are universal? Where did they come from? Well, it turns out that they were not discovered by observing people expressing emotion in real life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists based on a misunderstanding of Darwin, and they were adopted as universal truth, and then an entire science was built around them. But basically, these are Western stereotypes. They're widely held, fixed, and oversimplified images or ideas about emotional expressions. They're actually what in cognitive science we would call a caricature. And I should also say that these are Western stereotypes. They're not stereotypes that everybody holds. So, for example, anger means something different in Japan and in Turkey than it does in the United States and in Western Europe. And anger as a category doesn't even exist in some cultures. And there are emotions that are indigenous to other cultures, which don't exist in English and therefore are very rarely studied, even though they're very meaningful in those cultures. So simplistic stereotypes is really not a basis for developing AI. And if your AI is based on this, then basically what you're doing is enshrining stereotypes in code. So we need an AI that's based on emotions as they actually occur in the real world. And in the real world, an emotion category like anger is rich and full of situated variety, not randomness, but meaningful variation that is relational and contextualized. And this is how the raise of an eyebrow or the curl of a lip or the tilt of a head becomes meaningful as emotion. These movements are physical signals, and evidence, tremendous amounts of evidence suggests to us that physical signals have no inherent meaning. They become meaningful by when your brain makes them meaningful. That is, when the signals in your brain constrain signals from the world and vice versa. And what you get is a meaningful event. And to make my point, I'm going to give you a specially constructed experience so that you can get an intuition for what I'm talking about here. So if you have a look at this image, if you've never seen this demonstration before, then what's happening right now in your brain is that billions of neurons are attempting to make sense of the visual input that you see from the screen, from the signals off the screen. Your brain is searching through a lifetime of past experiences, issuing thousands of guesses, weighing probabilities, trying to answer the question, what is this most like? Not what is this, but what is this most like? And it's happening in the blink of an eye. Now, if you see only black and white blobs, then your brain has not found a good match, and you are in a state that philosophers call experiential blindness. So now I'm going to cure you of your blindness. So many people now see a bee or parts of a bee. And the reason why is that your brain now has new knowledge that it can use to make meaning of the signals coming off the screen. So that new knowledge came from the color photograph that I just showed you. And these signals in your brain change how you're experiencing the blobs right now. Your brain is constructing the image of a bee or part of a bee, even though no bee is actually present on the screen. And your experience is really some combination of the sensory present, the signals that are hitting your retinas in your eyes from the screen, and the signals in your brain. So your brain isn't reacting to the world, and it's not really running a model of the world. It's not really interpreting the world per se. It's modeling the many sensory surfaces of your body that receive physical signals from the world. Sensory surfaces like, your retina and the cochlea in each ear, and the sensory signals in your skin and in your nose and so on. And you also have sensory signals inside your body that monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide and how much glucose your cells are using, and the stretch of muscle fibers in your arms and legs, and even in the facial muscles that you have, the muscles in your face. And all of these sensory surfaces are continuously sending physical signals to your brain. These signals have no inherent psychological meaning. Your brain has to make them meaningful using signals that refer to events in the past. And this is what happened when I showed you the blobby image. And it's also what happens when you make meaning of a moving face as angry or sad or afraid or what have you. There's a similar misunderstanding, I think, about universal expressions when it comes to physical changes in our bodies. Each emotion category supposedly has a dedicated pattern of bodily changes that's supposed to be universal. So, some examples are, your heart increases, it's the rate of its beating in fear, and your blood pressure increases in anger, and so on. This is what widely held belief. And the idea is that if we can just measure enough signals, that we'll find a single signal, pattern of signals that is universally an indicator or diagnostic indicator of all instances of an emotion category, like anger or sadness or fear. And what I'm going to show you is that the evidence doesn't really support that. So again, for example, let's say in a study of sadness, let's say, for example, a scientist might measure changes in the autonomic nervous system. So like those arrayed on the y-axis, for example. And the x-axis here lists the changes in physiological signals during sadness relative to some resting baseline. So we might observe a pattern of changes like this. In sadness, there's an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, no change in skin conductance. And it's tempting to assume that this means that the autonomic nervous system pattern for sadness looks something like this. And sure, there might be some error, random error from instance to instance, from person to person, from study to study. But generally speaking, this is what the pattern should look like. So my lab statistically summarized hundreds of studies with more than 20,000 subjects to find that there's actually tremendous variation in the autonomic nervous system changes during sadness. And actually, there's substantial overlap that we see for every category of emotion that has ever been studied. So once again, variation is the norm. Now, this variation is not random. It's structured. And it's possible to discover this structure when we design our experiments appropriately. So again, I'm putting up a slide for you with an image of a paper which demonstrates that there are many-to-many mappings, meaning that for a given subject, a given person, who if we follow them across 2 weeks out in the world in their everyday life, and we use biological signals to trigger or prompt subjects to report how they're feeling, what we did is we use unsupervised machine learning algorithms to identify recurrent physiological motifs for a given subject. So reliable configurations of physiological signals that tend to recur in that subject. And then we examined how subjects what mental features they reported during those episodes. And what we see is a many-to-many pattern for an individual subject, meaning there are many physiological patterns that are associated with any emotion label like anger or sadness. And any given pattern is associated with more than one label, and that's within a subject. And this is all reliable. This is reliable structured variance that is detectable when you design your experiments properly. And I actually have slides to go through what we did here in the event that there's time to do that. Now, if you know something about how peripheral physiology works, this many-to-many mapping makes total sense, because the physical changes in your body are actually linked to your actions. They're not linked to something abstract like an emotion. And, for example, people do lots of different things when they're happy. So the physiological patterns will vary within an emotion category, right? So when you're happy, when might you be happy? Well, you might be happy if you're taking a walk in the woods with your friends. You might be happy if you're relaxing on the beach. You might be happy if you're vigorously beating a cake and baking a cake for your kids or for your friends. You might be happy when you're doing yoga, or when you're, gossiping at a coffee shop with friends, or when you're gardening. Each of these instances requires different actions, and therefore the physiological patterns will be different. So again, structured variation is the norm within and across emotion categories. And if you don't measure the context, then the variation will look like it's random to you. So the same physical signal can have different emotional meanings depending on the situation. So, for example, you might experience instance of low glucose as hunger when you're in a restaurant, and exactly the same glucose level would be experienced as fatigue at the end of the day, and it could be experienced as sadness if you're experiencing a loss or you're remembering a loss. Any physical signal from any surface of your body can become a part of an instance of emotion only when your brain makes those sensations meaningful as emotions. And what your brain is doing is it's remembering past instances of emotion as the best guess to what is causing these incoming signals. So every experience you have is a combination of the sensory present, the sensory signals from your body and from the world, and the remembered past. Every instance of emotion that you experience, every instance of emotion that you perceive, that you experience in someone else, as you experience someone else as having, is constructed this way. In fact, this is how every mental event that constitutes your mind is constructed, right? Physical signals become meaningful as instances of emotion in a larger ensemble of signals, context, if you will, that comes from the world and comes from your brain. And this is what we call a relational view of meaning. It's relational realism. Any physical signal of interest, heart rate, glucose metabolism, cortisol concentrations, any neurotransmitter release and uptake like dopamine or serotonin or what have no biologically prepared emotional meanings. Your brain creates that meaning based on what it's experienced and learned and experienced in the past. And when it comes to the brain's role in emotion, we again see this same kind of misunderstanding about universality that we saw with faces and physiology. There are supposedly dedicated emotion circuits in the brain, one for each emotion category. That's actually a very old, very well-entrenched view, that you're born with instincts, circuits for instincts and emotions in some ancient animalistic part of your brain. And then on top of that is layered the newer, neocortex, which contains the circuitry for cognition or rationality, and that one is supposed to clamp down on the other, and that's how you regulate your emotions. That's a complete myth. The brain evolution, evidence from brain evolution, brain development, brain function makes it super clear that that is a morality tale. It's an origin story of what it means to be a healthy, good person in the West, but it doesn't bear any resemblance to how your brain is structured or how it functions. And I'll just give you a couple of examples here to make my point. So the amygdala, which you have you have two amygdala in your brain, one on the left and right here. I'm just outlining one of them in red. This is the rock star, of emotion research when it comes to the brain. It's mentioned in many, many, many studies. It's very, business schools talk about this. The popular press talks about this a lot. The amygdala is supposed to contain the neural circuitry for fear. So my lab, again, statistically summarized hundreds of studies in which people were experiencing emotions while having their brains scanned to test this idea. Along the horizontal axis here is the proportion of studies that report an increase in amygdala activity when people were experiencing fear. And we did find indeed that there is an increase in amygdala activity during about 30% of the experiments when people experience fear, which is more frequently than you would expect by chance. But it's way too low to be the neural circuit for fear. And also, amygdala activity is not specific to fear. It's been observed in a variety of other instances of other emotion categories, as well as plenty of non-emotional events. So for example, if I put your head in a fMRI scanner and I showed you that blobby black and white image and you'd never seen it before, your amygdala would be going crazy. Because the amygdala is, first of all, the amygdala is not one thing. It's actually a cluster of nuclei, and the nuclei have somewhat different biological functions. But if we pull it all together, we could say what the amygdala's most job is signaling to the rest of the brain when when you need to learn something more, when you need to learn something about an event or an object in the world that is still reasonably uncertain, and so the brain needs to learn more about it to be able to figure out what to do, to better organize your meaning making and your responses in the future. This pattern, though, of findings where we have low reliability and high non-specificity for amygdala in fear holds for every brain region that's ever been claimed to be the location of some emotion. So again, variation is the norm, not random variation, structured variation, which is you can model it if you design your experiments right. So I'm just going to give you a couple of other pieces of evidence because I want to really drive this point home. Intracranial measurements with depth electrodes in humans makes it clear. And so here I've pointed out where the depth electrodes are. So right in the amygdala on the left and the right side with the green and red arrows. These studies are measuring amygdala neuron response, so changes in amygdala neuron firing when patients were being shown images of objects that were neutral or threatening. And amygdala neurons increased their firing rate 300 to 600 milliseconds after the onset of a threatening image, only when the person was paying attention to the image, and only after other areas of the brain, including areas of the cerebral cortex, already had increased their firing. And so what these findings suggest is that there is extensive recurrent processing in other brain regions before amygdala neurons change or ramp up their frequency of action potentials in response to a threat. And when they do, it takes 300 to 600 milliseconds, which is too slow to mount a fear-related response that could actually keep you alive, to protect you from threat. And just one more, just to pound that nail into the coffin, consider this evidence. These are the brains of monozygotic twins with almost total amygdala lesions. So these two sisters share 100% of their genes. One sister, BG, has some difficulty experiencing and perceiving fear in most circumstances, although she can experience fear in certain circumstances, and she can also learn to be fearful. Her sister, on the other hand, has, normal fear responses. And so this, again, is evidence that a human brain can create fear in multiple ways, that variation, right, is the norm. And in biology, this variation is called degeneracy or multiple realizability. There's more than one way that the brain can make a fear response, an instance of fear. And when we look outside the amygdala to look for whole brain signals for fear, we also see here that variation is the norm. Here, what I'm showing you are brain activation patterns from 3 studies in which people were experiencing fear as they had their brain scanned. Each study used supervised machine learning solutions to find the brain pattern for fear. And as you can see, each study found a different pattern. So again, this is meaningful variation, evidence that a human brain can create fear in multiple ways. And I also just want to point out to you that none of these activation maps is actually a real brain state. These are just statistical abstractions that don't appear in anyone's brain ever. So a pattern to say distinguish fear from anger might work really well in one study, but the evidence suggests that the actual patterns of activation in each subject looks different than the statistical pattern or statistical summary for fear. So these are not biomarkers for emotions. They are statistical abstractions. So just like we would say, well, the average number of people in a middle-class family in the United States is 3.13 people, but no family actually has 3.13 people in it, right? It's a statistical abstraction. And that's the same thing that's true with these patterns. And, the patterns vary from study to study. If you were expecting one biomarker for fear, you would see this as a problem. You'd see it as a bug. But if you take a relational realism approach to emotion, understanding emotion, this idea that instances of emotion are made by brains, they're not detected or they don't just happen in an obligatory way, then this makes complete sense. So variation in emotional responding is real. The signals in the world and in your body are highly variable and complex. They're situated. And the signals in your brain constrain this variation to create meaning, to create instances of emotion that we experience in ourselves and also that we experience other people as having. This is a problem that William James pointed out 150 years ago, that we reify these experiences and then we assume that we're detecting these experiences in the world. So we automatically and effortlessly make meaning of signals from our bodies in relation to the signals in the world. And then because it's so effortless and because it's so automatic, then we believe that we're detecting things when in fact we're not. We're actually making them. So the punchline here is that instances of emotion that seem to happen to you are actually made by you. You may not have an awareness that this is what's going on under the hood in your brain, but your brain is always attempting to make meaning of your the signals from your body in relation to the signals from the world using past experiences that you've learned. And correspondingly, the emotions that you seem to detect in other people are actually partly inside your own head, right? Every instance of emotion, in fact, every instance of everything that you experience and that you do is some combination of the sensory present and the remembered past. The remembered past are signals in your brain and only in your brain. So emotions exist as ensembles of interwoven signals, some of which are only found in your brain. And these signals are what create meaning in terms of the signals. Like, what does it mean? What do the signals mean in your body in relation to the rest of the ensemble in the world? And here, meaning isn't some semantic abstraction. Meaning is literally what the brain wants to know is what do you need to do next to keep yourself alive and well? And that's what meaning here refers to. So for emotion AI to be successful, whether it's in the courtroom or the boardroom or the classroom or the living room, the entire ensemble of signals must be measured, and variation across situations must be met. So let me say it differently. The entire ensemble must be measured, and it has to be measured across situations, across people, and across cultures. And I know that sounds like, like a tall order, but it is. Um, and but I guess what I would say is, no one seems to bat an eyelash at that kind of an orientation when in physics, for example, people are willing to build a hadron collider for what is it, $65 million or something, in order to, detect, or really, actually, it's not exactly detect, but I mean, electrons themselves are relationally real events as well. But to make meaning of signals, as electrons. And I guess my main message to you is that right now, companies and funding agencies are spending millions of research dollars to build emotion detection systems that are fundamentally asking the wrong questions. Emotions don't live in your face or in your body or solely in your brain to be detected. They exist as ensembles of signals. And some of the signals necessarily involve the signals that are creating meaning, which are the signals in the brain. And until we start actually measuring those signals with sufficient sampling, with sufficient range to observe variation, we'll never be able to discover the structure in that variation, which is there, in order to properly answer the question. Because in the end, if you want to read, infer emotion in people, you have to accept the possibility that there might not be one vocabulary of motifs or ensembles that even work for a given person across situations, right? There might be much more heterogeneity within an individual across situations. And that it changes the complexity of the task, of the question, to begin with. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention, and we'll move to the next, the Q&A part of the session.
All right, thank you so much to Lisa. We have a very lively chat right now, so I'm excited to read through some of these. The first question comes from Jonathan Den. How about AI determining emotion from text instead of images?
Well, I guess I would say that you probably have to phrase your question a little bit more specifically. So, for example, the meaning of a word depends on the other words. This is like the idea of distributional semantics, right? The meaning of a word depends on the other words with which it appears. And the same word, sometimes even with the same intonation, can actually have a pleasant or an unpleasant meaning for someone. So let me just say it this way. If you're measuring one modality and you're measuring only a few signals in that modality, in principle, you may be able to find a predictable pattern, a pattern that predicts well in your sample, but it's not going to generalize. And I think words are a great example. No, words don't have inherent valence. Valence, whether something is pleasant or unpleasant, is not in a word. It's actually, those are features that are only computed by a brain. They're not in, like, something is threat, reward, pleasure, displeasure. Those are all features that are only computed in your brain in response to or in relation to signals coming from the word or the object. So if you're looking for if you're asking a generic question, like what does anger look like in text, or what does threat look like in text, then you're asking the wrong question. That's what I would suggest. That's what the evidence suggests. I'm ready for the next question.
Okay, the next question is there a biomarker for fear, realizing that, as you point out, the patterns are statistical abstractions of brain response? We all discuss fear, and others seem to understand the concept. So is there some common phenomenon or bio response?
I think I just showed you that the answer is no. And of course, I only showed you a few studies. So, I mean, I think it's actually an assertion that you're making that is not defensible, frankly, that the premise of your question, we all know what fear is and we all understand it. We all meaning who? You mean the people in this very Western meeting? Sure. But fear is not, the meaning of fear is not universal. So for example, what do we think that the classic expression of fear is in this culture? It's to run or to freeze. But in other cultures, like Bali, for example, the stereotypic response is to fall asleep. And you might say, well, that's just crazy. They're wrong. But why are they wrong? All right. There are actually some animals in the ocean, when they face a predator, have to slow their heart rate because sharks and other kind of predators can detect those vibrations. And so some fish routinely actually fall asleep in the face of threat. So my point is that, first of all, logically, I sort of disagree with your premise, and I think the evidence would suggest that your premise is incorrect. Just because something is common sense to you and the people that you know doesn't mean it's universal around the world. But also, I would say the evidence, the empirical evidence, just you're never going to find a biomarker that works for all instances or even most instances of fear when you ask that question in a generic way. People do find brain patterns for fear, like a statistical pattern, that's an abstraction, and it doesn't ever generalize outside that study. And if it were to, my guess would be that you'd be sampling exactly the same kinds of situations, which means that you're not really you're not really you know, if you have to constrain what you sample in order to get something to generalize, then you're not really finding a biomarker per se. So I think asking, you know, I'll just put it this way. Anyone can do anything they want. As a scientist, I am inherently a pluralist, but personally, I would not waste my money or my time looking for a biomarker. I prefer to follow what the evidence suggests. There's been 100 years at least of studies attempting to find biomarkers in one way or another for for Western English emotion categories, and no one's been able to do it. And I think what this means is that we're asking the wrong question. That if we want to be able to predict people's emotional, the instances of emotion that people experience and express, we have to be asking different kinds of questions in order to try to answer, to find an answer that will work.
Okay, thank you. Is there an accurate manner of inferring emotional valence from voice or speech?
Well, again, I would say, so the evidence suggests that actually arousal is a easier feature to estimate than valence, positivity, negativity. But again, I would say that studies certainly claim to do it, but the patterns don't generalize from one study to the next. So in a given study, you can find a pattern that, this is also true for physiology, you know, in a given study, you can find a pattern that will distinguish pleasant from unpleasant, but that pattern doesn't necessarily generalize across studies. And even more importantly, I would say, so like, let's say you measure a facial muscle movement. You're measuring facial movements, right? A facial movement that you can detect with your eyes or with a camera is actually an endpoint movement that is manifest as multiple patterns of actual muscle fiber movements. And the brain is regulating the individual muscle fiber movements, right? So same thing with physiological patterns. So when your heart rate goes up, that is a combination of both your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. The one pattern to get your heart rate to raise is for your sympathetic nervous system to ramp up and your parasympathetic nervous system to withdraw its control of the heart. That's called a reciprocal activation. But there are other patterns that can produce a heart rate increase. So you can just get a heart rate increase from withdrawal. Your sympathetic nervous system stays the same and parasympathetic innervation of the heart withdraws. That will increase your heart rate. Or if your parasympathetic nervous system stays the same, then your sympathetic nervous system has to increase even more in order to get the heart rate up. To a brain, your brain doesn't care about your heart rate. Your brain cares about the lower level, you know, higher dimensional details. That's what it's regulating. So we're measuring as scientists, right? As people, we look at each other and we make inferences about the movements that we can detect with our senses. But that person's brain is actually not regulating an expression. It's regulating, you know, very, 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 like a very high, a space of high dimensionality full of signals. So I guess, you know, the way we approach things in our lab is a little bit different than the way I think questions have been approached in the past. In the past, what scientists do is they use their own experiences and then they ask, you know, their own experiences of anger or sadness or fear or what have you, their own experience of looking at people and watching them move their faces in particular ways, or listening to their voices in particular ways. And then we go looking for the physical basis of those experiences in the brain. But we're looking at a level of, as humans, we experience things at a level of granularity that's very different from what the brain is actually regulating. And so if you start with questions about how does a brain evolve, is a brain develop, how is it structured, this leads you to ask very, very different questions about how a brain might produce an expression or how it might perceive one.
Thank you. Our next question. When we remember how we felt at a certain event or point in time, does this mean we are just having our brain fire in the same pattern as we did back then?
Yes, actually, that's exactly right. So memory is really nothing more. I say it's like a totally miraculous thing, but memory is nothing more than your brain re-implementing signal ensembles from the past. And the really cool thing, I guess there are two cool things about this. One is that when you remember and your brain is re-implementing these signal ensembles from the past, the memory is now considered to be in an active state. So if you do something different with that, while that ensemble is implemented, it can change the meaning of that original event. Its meaning can change. And so memories are considered to be, when you retrieve a memory, which just means that your brain is actually re-implementing the signals, the memory is considered to be in an active state, and it can be changed, and for better or for worse. But this is one of the bases upon which, therapy works, for example, because what you're doing often in a therapy session is you're remembering something and then you're actively changing its meaning by adding new signals. The second point to make, though, is that your brain, every human brain every neurotypical human brain has a very, very powerful capacity to what's called conceptual combination. And this is a fancy word to mean the brain can take bits and pieces of past experiences that you've never had before, the bits and pieces. So let me say it differently. Your brain can take bits and pieces of different past events and combine them into a new event of meaning making. This allows you to experience something that you've never experienced before. If your brain can't make meaning, if it can't re-implement anything from your past, either from a single past event or a combination of events that it's mixing and matching, you'll be experientially blind. It will be like visual noise or auditory noise to you. But if your brain can mix and match from the past to produce something that is close enough to make meaning of the signals, then your brain can make meaning of those signals, and you'll have an actual experience. And I'm kind of fumbling with my words because at the same time I'm trying to actually find an example that I want to show you to make my point. And I removed this example actually from the talk because I was worried that I wasn't going to have enough time. But I'm just going to share my screen again to show you an example about what I mean here. So let me just, okay. So are you seeing a video now? Can someone just tell me, are you seeing a video?
No, Lisa, we're not seeing it.
You're not seeing a video. Okay. Let me try it again. Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. So my guess is that you've probably never actually seen electrical towers playing jump rope in real life. But somehow you understand that's what's happening here. because your brain is assembling bits and pieces of past experiences to make sense of a novel set of visual signals that you probably have never encountered before. So this is what your brain does when it's assembling memories, even though most of the time you don't actually experience yourself remembering anything. But this movie also demonstrates another really cool thing about meaning making, and that is, if you just watch the screen for a minute, you might be able to feel the thud of the towers as they hit the ground. And you might be able to actually hear a little bit like the ghost of a thud when the towers hit the ground. But there is no sound coming from this movie, and there is no vibration. This is only visual signals. So on the basis of visual input only, your brain is actually guessing at the other sensory signals that would likely be there based on your past experience. And it's actually changing the firing of its own neurons, its own somatosensory neurons, its own auditory neurons, to anticipate those incoming signals that it expects. And this is part of, when I say every act of meaning, every experience you have, every single thing you do is some combination of what's in your head and what's in the world and what's in your body. This is what I mean, that your brain is actively contributing signals that create what you experience. It's not, you're not just detecting things in the world.
All right, thank you. Those of us on the back end, I just want to say that we've all agreed this is the most questions we've received from a virtual event in a long time. So this is just really fantastic to see how involved people are. Our next question, Lisa, is this. Super thought-provoking talk. In what ways do you think AI and machine learning can be useful in emotion research and understanding?
Oh my goodness. I think that when it's done right, it will revolutionize our understanding of emotion. So, you know, I think that one of the problems that if you look back, let's say in the history of psychology and in neuroscience to some extent, people had to find a way to deal with the complexity of real life, to try to understand how people act and how their experiences occur in tremendously complex situations. And what they had to do really, was they had to sort of strip away a lot of the complexity and hold it constant. And they basically a kind of like a 19th century machine kind of metaphor, like simple linear deterministic causal model, where, you think about the world in these kind of like really simplistic kind of mechanistic ways, like in a Newtonian kind of world, okay? And that was necessary because no one had any way of dealing with the complexity of managing. You could never sample the variation and find meaning, structure in that variation. It's just not possible to do. But it is possible now. I think AI makes it entirely possible as long as you're willing to look. Like, here's how I think about it. If behavioral science was funded at the level of physics, which, by the way, also uses relational realism and doesn't use Newtonian mechanics anymore, except in really specific situations, and they know it's like it's an abstraction that's not true, that's just useful in particular situations, right? I mean, physics and chemistry, biology have all gone beyond. They're all using highly complex modeling. I think if we did the same thing, we'd be able to actually answer the question that people are asking. It's just the answer isn't going to look like what we originally were, like the question we were originally asking. So I think that the answer really to understanding what emotions are and how they work lies in the use of AI. It's just I would just, I would go about it I mean, I do go about it in very different ways. Okay, I think we're right. So probably.
Okay, great, Liz. Thank you for helping with the questions, and thank you, Lisa, for your talk, for your answers, and thank you everyone for your participation. So before finishing, let me announce that in our next seminar on January 31st, we will have with us Virginia Dignam, and the talk. So the title of the talk would be Beyond the AI Hype: Balancing Innovation and Social Responsibility. Again, please remember to register if you want to attend the seminar. And for more information about our seminars, remember that you can visit our website, and you can also sign up for our newsletter. So that's all for today. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time.